Hello and welcome to Geeky Bit. Today I'm going to talk to you about a hypothetical Mac that I think probably should have been. This is one of a few videos that I'm doing for Macintosh. These videos will be treated more of a bonus and obviously not interrupt the tech history series. Now you might be wondering, what do I mean by the Mac that should have been? Well, I'm going to tell you. I think it's the Apple IIGS. It was the next and last in the line of the Apple II series, meant to replace the Apple IIs. Technically, it was in development before the first Mac as the Apple IIX. However, it never came to fruition because the Apple R&D budget was shifted to the new Macintosh, and they just didn't have the budget at the time to resolve the issues that it had during R&D. The second time around of development, it was called the Apple IIGS and was eventually released in 1986, and it only cost $999 compared to the $2,500 of the Mac 128K of the same time period. Now let's talk about the Apple IIGS versus the Mac, and I'll tell you why I think the original Macintosh probably should have failed over the Apple IIGS. During the early days of the Macintosh development, the Apple higher-ups precluded the Apple II team from Apple events, even though the Apple II team was the driving cash cow force for Apple at the time. Apple even went as far as to put the Macintosh team on a pedestal over the Apple II team, even though the Apple II team was delivering all the cash to the company at the time. Frustrated by this and the lack of development funds for the Apple II team because it was being funneled into the Macintosh team, and a few other things, Steve Wozniak decided to leave Apple in 1985. So was the Apple IIGS actually better than those original Macs? Yes and no. Apple actively crippled the CPU in the Apple IIGS. It was meant to be an 8 MHz processor, but it was brought down to only 2.8 MHz. The artificial speed cap on those CPUs was brought as a result of the contemporary Macs having circles run around them by the Apple IIGS when it was set at 8 MHz. And then it even had color over those black and white Macs, and it was even cheaper after you paid for all the extras to make it have all the stuff that a Macintosh would have had at the time. Not to mention, it was backwards compatible with Apple IIs. Year after year, Apple touted the Macintosh as the next big thing, but they already had it in the Apple IIGS. And that was a product the Apple II team still developed, despite the bulk of their R&D budget being diverted to the Macintosh teams. And compared to other contemporary hardware, it was insanely good. Here is the Macintosh and IIGS GUI side by side, and while the Macintosh does look crisper with its higher resolution, the color really pops in the IIGS and it looks like a more polished operating system because of that, at least in my opinion. Here are my thoughts about how the Apple Macintosh should have played out. If Apple hadn't shunned the Apple II teams and embraced them for the cash cows they were, we would have seen an Apple IIGS Plus a lot sooner, and it wouldn't have been vaporware. It probably would have been released in the early 90s instead of mid to late 90s talk to keep Apple II fans happy. Now I'm going to create a what if scenario for you, and it's going to get pretty wild, but it actually has a lot of basis in things we know about Apple. So assuming Steve Wozniak stayed on a little longer instead of quitting, making sure the Apple IIGS stayed at that 8 MHz. The circles that Apple IIGS ran around those original Macs made them push the Apple IIGS more, and by the 90s, the Apple IIGS Plus was released at 14 to 20 MHz. Much like our timeline, this fictitious timeline would have Steve Jobs voted out, but it would be more because of the failures of those original Macintoshes. Around 1993 or 1994, the Apple II team was making great strides in the Apple IIGS line, but owning the Macintosh name, Apple decided to name their new Macintosh the Macintosh IIGS Revision 2, and this model would come with a 30 or 40 MHz processor, perhaps even an Intel processor. By 1995, all of the original Macintosh teams had been dissolved, and only the best of the best was kept around and rolled into the Apple II teams. This restructuring allowed for the original Copeland, or System 8 now, to be released and be a fully pre preemptive multitasking operating system. Steve Wozniak, seeing all of these changes, had a change of heart himself and decided to go back to Apple and have a part in this new Macintosh, which now used Intel processors. These new Macintoshes had an Apple IIGS sub-processing unit, which allowed for full backwards compatibility all the way to the original Apple IIs. That, coupled with their fantastic operating system and the Intel processors, made the adoption rate for Macintoshes and Macintosh clones soar through the roof. The waning interest in PCs had made Microsoft pivot away from operating systems and focus more on Office software. By the early 2000s, Apple had released the iPhone with Zune integration, and Microsoft had the Xbox, Zune, Office software, and Internet Explorer as their staple products. Of course, they still had their server-side products with Microsoft Server. With all that Steve Wozniak had done, and the fact that he realized there were more capable younger engineers now, he stepped away from the engineering and took on more of a managerial role, finally landing him in the CEO seat, and made Apple have a push towards the right to repair, and also a more eco-friendly company. Unlike in our reality, in this fictitious scenario, Apple is only worth $500 million to $1 trillion. And Next Step faded into obscurity, along with it Steve Jobs, as he never was offered a position back at Apple because Apple never had a reason to offer him said position. In this fictitious reality, instead of the term PC, it's Apple, or Macintosh, or just computer. Microsoft has since been bought out by Apple. These newly acquired products are what Apple are using to combat Google's products. The Xbox One is now renamed to the Xbox Pippin, and later just the Pippin. Of course, all of that was wild speculation based on a few facts that we know, and if things were done a little different, we may have very well seen this, thus making the Apple IIGS the Macintosh I think we should have gotten. I know this video is a little different than what I normally do, as it's pure speculation and my point of view. If you did enjoy it as much as I did making it, feel free to like it, and if you aren't subscribed so already, you're welcome to do so. And if you want to get notifications of when I do these videos, please feel free to click the bell button.